You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
Welcome, everyone, to another Swapcast of the Around the Empire and Foreign Policy Focus podcast. I'm the host of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast, Kyle Ansel, and with me is the host of the Around the Empire podcast, Joanne Leone. Joanne, welcome.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I think we have a great thing put together for our audiences today. So the show will appear on both feeds. Joanne's show, I know she promotes the YouTube channel. Is there anywhere else you want to tell people to share the show from or listen to it?
No, just my website, all the mobile podcast apps, on Patreon, and on YouTube.
All right. And then you find my show at the Libertarian Institute, and the URL is libertarianinstitute.org. So what the great show we have today is all about Russiagate stuff. Joanne, I think pretty much throughout the history of both our podcasts, we've been shared guests and guests on each other's shows talking about this subject. So I'm so happy that we continue to cover this together. It's just unfortunate that we still have to.
Yeah.
We're 3 years into the Trump administration now. I know we were covering this at one point in 2017. So, we were talking about this year one and kind of being like, hey, this is getting kind of ridiculous. And, we're now down the road and it seems like half the country is just fine to chant this mantra that Russia hacked the election. And, they're the Russiagators. And then the rest of us kind of, have seen beyond the, headlines at CNN and MSNBC or the Daily Beast, Huffington Post, read even their own articles and kind of realized that, hey, there's really not much to this whole story there. I
agree with that. And we also don't like, in my case, there are a number of things that really bother me about this. One is that, whether you like this president or not, I know most of us don't. Well, yeah, most of our friends don't.
Disclaimer that, me and Joanne are no fans, friends, have any political leanings resembling Donald Trump's. It's not that we want this guy to be president. And in fact, I think if either of us were congressmen, we would bring articles of impeachment against Trump tomorrow on a variety of issues. I'm guessing we both agree on, at least on the war on Yemen. So, just let's say that right there, but go on, explaining how the lunacy of Russiagate means that we now have to defend Donald Trump against this impeachment.
Yeah, I mean, that's what makes it piss me off even just that much more. But here's the thing, I don't want John Brennan choosing my president either. And I don't want this permanent bureaucracy and it's not just the government people. Of course, there's the whole war profiteering industry and all the other ones. I don't want them undermining a presidency, hijacking it. And I feel like that's what happened. And I feel like it keeps getting worse. And to me, that's worse than having Donald Trump in there. Because at least Donald Trump, we could vote him out, right? So these guys, we can't vote out. And we didn't elect any of them. So that really bothers me. Plus, as you were talking about, Kyle, we've talked about a lot of times, is this just drives us further and further into a Cold War, even toward a nuclear war or a world war, just something, totally unnecessarily. And it becomes an existential threat.
Yeah, no, right. And, I really, agree with all that, especially, the one person that shouldn't be picking the president is John Brennan. That said, I'm really not necessarily opposed even to a stupid impeachment against Donald Trump just because I don't support the guy. But, I get it's the practical effects of this that, the U.S. and Trump's 2020 budget, he's now going to give $250 million in lethal aid to Ukraine. Now, you don't think that part of that has to do with all this impeachment, that they've actually practically changed Donald Trump's foreign policy to make it more hawkish. And that's the real danger to all of this. And, I think we have a lot of clips to play today, Joanne, so maybe we should start going through those. But I think this first one by one of the witnesses at the Democrats' impeachment hearing just highlights the importance of, how this Russiagate turns into foreign policy nonsense.
Right. And we've heard in a number of the witnesses in these so-called impeachment hearings, we've heard things where we see them veering off into one of their biggest gripes is, that he's not doing foreign policy right. He's not doing it right. And in this case, so we had the Intelligence Committee hearings and we had the various, career, whatever they call them, career foreign service people. But then, the impeachment process switched over to the Judiciary Committee, which is where it belongs, by the way. The Intelligence Committee was really not supposed to be involved in this, but it's clear that they're the ones driving it. And, you can take from that what you want. So anyway, they had the Judiciary Committee hearings. This is Gerald Nadler is the chair of that committee, and he brought 4 lawyers up. And I guess their main goal was to just convince everyone that impeachment was the right thing to do here. And this woman, she got a lot of press, probably more than any of the others, although Jonathan Turley did get a lot of press too. But her name is Pamela Karlan, and she is a law professor at Stanford Law School. She doesn't hide the fact that she's a strong partisan, but she's always a bit of a zealot, I think. And you can you can see that from this clip. One clip of many weird things she said, but this one in particular.
It isn't just our national interest in protecting our own elections. It's not just our national interest in making sure that the Ukraine remains strong and on the front lines so they fight the Russians there and we don't have to fight them here. But it's also our national interest in promoting democracy worldwide. And if we look hypocritical about this, if we look like we're asking other countries to interfere in our election, if we look like we're asking other countries to engage in criminal investigations of our president's political opponents, then we're not doing our job of promoting our national interest in being that shining city on a hill.
Fight them over there, or so we don't have to fight them here. Why do we have to fight them at all?
Right. Well, this may be the single most uninformed person I have ever heard. Just going through all the things she says are utter nonsense. She takes like the line from the terrorism, the fight them over there so we don't have to fight them over here, and applies it to Russia, which in a way terrifies me, because if this becomes a talking point, that's like kind of already seen as like an effective chant and mantra with the right. So if they all start chanting that and get caught on, we could, really get stuck in this whole NATO having all of our armies on the front lines, on the borders with Russia, like we do in the Baltic states, trying to get Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. That's terrifying. That she would adopt those two policies together. But then to talk about the U.S. and not meddling in elections, and that Donald Trump asking the Ukrainian president to investigate Joe Biden is going to be the foreign policy action of the United States that's going to discredit us in the eyes of the world as not being the shining city on the hill is unbelievable. Like, look at Yemen. Look at Afghanistan. Look at Syria. Look at what the United States is doing in those countries, lady. Like, you think that this is going to discredit? What about Bolivia and Venezuela and Iran and North Korea? We're waging in Hong Kong, all the things we're doing in all of these places and all the interference. And then this is going to be the time that it's going to show the world. Like Trump has had 3 years now of waging war. And this is what you're hyper focused on. It's crazy.
Yeah, I don't know what world she lives in. I mean, at that very moment that she's saying this, we just meddled in basically helped overturn the results of the Bolivia election by military coup. We're still trying to figure out how to overthrow the Venezuelan government. The Ukraine government, we backed a coup to even put this government in place. This string of governments at this point. In Hong Kong, it's insane. I mean, really, what else can you say? I don't like to use words that are too strong, but it's nuts.
Right. And that this is the person that the Democrats pit to go up and explain why Trump needs to be impeached is terrifying. Because if this is the Democratic position that Donald Trump needs to be impeached because he was taking away America's support for Ukraine to not fight them over there, so we don't have to fight them over here. What the hell is she talking about? Fighting Russia over here means nuclear warfare. Fighting Russia over there means nuclear warfare. We're not fighting Russia. It's lunacy, and it is reflected more in the Democratic Party. I'm sure. I don't know if you're ready to move on to the next clip, but Nancy Pelosi. We could get into what she believes. Yeah.
Let me just make one more point about why that was so offensive. It invokes. Isn't that what Bush said about the war in Iraq? You know what I mean? It invokes some of the worst foreign policy disasters and military disasters in the history of this country by using that language. Am I off base there? Isn't that what Bush said? We'll have to fight them over there. So then we don't have to fight the terrorists over there. So we don't have to fight them over here. Well, that's why I was saying
that I was worried that the right would again start, that would be a chant that would now catch on with the right.
I gotcha.
Then we're going to end up in the NATO conversation forever because we have to keep our armies in Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania and Poland and all the way up on the border with Russia, because if we move them back, then that means we're going to fight them over here. That's the same thing that they believe why we have to stay in Afghanistan and Iraq. And you could talk to people today and they still believe that if the U.S. doesn't stay in Iraq, then terrorists will attack us over here.
Yeah.
And we can't let that become a slogan with Russia. And that the Democrats are putting this out is very worrisome. And it seems that the party leadership believes it, that this, is obviously an important person. This is the person that they put up there to testify, to explain to the nation why Donald Trump needs to be impeached. And this is what she comes up with.
Right. You were way ahead of me on that, Kyle. Sorry about that. Let's go to Pelosi because I don't even know what I was watching with her. This is a montage of clips. There was sort of a Nancy Pelosi day in the past week, and this is when she made the official announcement that they were moving ahead with impeachment. And it was well staged. She had the flags behind her. She was wearing the white pantsuit, and she had a written statement, and it invoked all kinds of language from the preamble in the Constitution, and I don't know, Declaration of Independence, maybe, I'm not even sure. I think she threw some religion in there. And, this was her solemn pronouncement that they're going to impeach the president. And she also, as if that wasn't enough, Pelosi for one day, then she did a town hall that night on cable TV. So these clips are from Nancy Pelosi Day.
The facts are uncontested. The president abused his power for his own personal political benefit at the expense of our national security by withholding military aid and crucial Oval Office meeting in exchange for an announcement of an investigation into his political rival. Our democracy is what is at stake. The president leaves us no choice but to act because he is trying to corrupt once again the election for his own benefit. Let me just say this. This isn't, we are saying the Ukraine. The Ukraine was the vehicle of the president's action, asking a president of another country to make an announcement that he was investigating the president's political opponent and withholding military assistance that was voted by the Congress of the United States. Unless and until he did so, the president did so. But this isn't about Ukraine. This is about Russia, who benefited by our withholding of that military assistance. Russia. It's about Russia. So sometimes people say, well, I don't know about Ukraine. I don't know that much about Ukraine. Well, our adversary in this is Russia. All roads lead to Putin. Understand that.
Because there's really no other explanation for it. All roads lead to Putin. Joanne, and it wasn't explicit in the Sondland testimony that the military aid had absolutely nothing to do with even the alleged quid pro quo that's just about the White House meeting. Now can we start there with that like obvious lie that I don't even understand how she gets away with telling?
Well, I mean, I don't know how you can. They didn't even know that the aid was being withheld. So I'm not quite sure how you can threaten someone if they don't know they're being threatened, for one, or how you can have a quid pro quo when, yeah. And Sondland said that the only thing that, what he was talking about, I mean, that whole Sondland thing, that was a mess. He said, yeah, there was a quid pro quo, but then it turns out he's talking about a visit to the White House, an announcement of an investigation in exchange for a visit to a White House. And then he admits that directly between he and Trump, when he straight up asked Trump, he said, what do you want from Ukraine? And Trump said, I think I can still kind of quote it. He said, I don't want anything from Zelensky. He just needs to tell Zelensky to do the right thing, tell him to do what he ran on. And what he ran on was to end the war, the civil war in Ukraine, on transparency and to clean up the corruption. So, they've gone all this time without Obama was afraid to give them military aid. I have read, and I can't confirm this, but I've read that we're not even storing, I think it's Moon of Alabama, we're not even storing these Javelin missiles anywhere near the front line of the war, anywhere near the border with Russia, to supposedly shoot them at all the Russian tanks that are going to invade, which is, sometimes I can't even, it's just crazy.
Well,
I don't know if I answered your question.
And I believe that just to extend a little bit more on the Javelin missiles, I believe the U.S. actually keeps those under lock and key because of the concerning elements in the Ukrainian military, specifically their ties to neo-Nazi groups. But yeah, I mean, I think you really, did address that the allegations against Trump for the impeachment, all the hearings that we just heard, was that the quid pro quo was that Zelensky, the allegation of one, and again, which, I think me and you both say is a little, is that, Zelensky would have had to announce that he was investigating Burisma and the Biden connection in order to get a meeting with Donald Trump. He never made the announcement. He got a meeting with Donald Trump anyways. But that's the alleged quid pro quo. And Nancy Pelosi can't even keep it straight. She's up there, now saying that it's about the military aid, which just isn't the case. Which, I think it's also concerning that she says that, who does that benefit? Russia, and that automatically means it's bad. Because, we've seen this in part with the Trump foreign policy too, that anything he wants to do, they're like, oh, that will help Russia. If Donald Trump wants to withdraw troops from Syria, who benefits? Russia. He wants to ease sanctions on Russia or have meetings with Putin, that benefits Russia. It's so good for Russia. And I'm sure it's at least partially in the factors, with Trump being so, really hawkish against Russia, far more so than Obama, when you look at the actual policy.
Yeah. I agree. I agree with everything you just said. And plus, just the whole issue, sort of the dominating theme is that this is in our national interest. I don't think anybody has ever convinced anyone in this country, or certainly not a plurality of people in this country, that our assistance to Ukraine is in the interest of the United States. In fact, people have been asked, well, what about the countries on the border like Lithuania or whatever? Are you willing to invoke the NATO Article 5? Or, if Lithuania says Russia attacked us, well then, since they're part of NATO, we're all supposed to join in and go to war against Russia, right? And didn't they do a poll where people were like, hell no, I'm not going to go fight for Lithuania? And there's a big question. The Eastern European countries have serious doubts as to whether we would come to their aid if they start a war or if they got into some kind of a war with Russia. So, yeah.
Well, that is very important because, that was something that when Trump said during his campaign, of course, he said other things about NATO that were more positive or suggesting keeping the alliance around, but kind of getting at the point that, look, it doesn't benefit America to be in alliance with Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania or Montenegro or North Macedonia, or, even larger states like Poland, Germany, Ukraine, because their defenses don't really do anything to benefit the U.S., whereas our defenses are everything to them. Our nuclear deterrent is what, keeps Russia at bay and, allows these countries to operate in a world where they don't have to worry, about any Russian aggression, even if it's just, kind of a perceived fiction of theirs. And that I think is in part why the deep state took such a negative feeling towards Trump, because, if Trump says that we could get along with Russia and that we really don't need NATO and it's not beneficial, that means a lot less weapon sales. That means, a lot less generals, a lot less, cushy postings in Europe, think tanks, the Rand Corp and all these different places are gonna not be funded so well. They're not gonna be so important anymore.
Exactly. And not to get ahead of ourselves, but, this whole thing about how Ukraine and not giving military aid to Ukraine jeopardizes our national security, which is an absurd assertion to begin with. It was a dominating theme in these impeachment things. And it's also, I haven't gone into detail or read in detail. I know that the Democrats actually introduced 2 articles of impeachment today. So I guess they just put them on the table. I don't think they've done anything actually with them yet. But the very first one, guess what's in it, Kyle? It says that, quote, that Trump, quote, compromised the national security of the United States. And, in the framework of this call with Ukraine and this situation with Zelensky and the military aid, what does that mean? It just means that they're carrying this ridiculous assertion that they put forward and no one challenged, apparently, that, withholding this aid jeopardized our national security. So not only did they say this ridiculous thing, they've now codified it into an article of impeachment. And I just think that that's wrong and dangerous for all the reasons that we're laying out here.
Okay, Joanne, I know you highlighted an interview by AG Barr as being very important. Do you want to start getting into the clips for that?
Yeah, and I think that, let me just say the reason why I brought this up. The cable news channels and almost all of the quote-unquote newspapers have been pushing this now. I think everybody's pretty familiar with the Democrats' point of view on this. But what gets less air is the defense. Let's just call it, we won't even say the Democrats and the Republicans. Let's just say the pro-impeachment and the anti-impeachment. So mixed in with the articles of impeachment that came out, with all kinds of things came out in the last 2 days. One of them was the IG report. The IG report, we've been waiting for that since he's been working on it for, more than a year. And originally it was supposed to come out last May, so about 6 months ago. It got delayed and delayed. There were some reasons given for it, but it's kind of murky as to why it was delayed. It was finally released yesterday, and it's like a 446 pages PDF page document. And one of the things they examine is the FISA court warrants that were sought by the FBI in this Crossfire Hurricane investigation that started July 31st, 2016. And I guess there were all kinds of violations that came out that were found by the IG. And the IG himself is the Department of Justice Inspector General. He has he's a powerful person. He's supposed to, everybody knows what an Inspector General does. They examine the wrongdoings. It's the way that they investigate themselves. But he is limited in that he doesn't have subpoena power. He can't indict anyone. And he also, the scope of his investigation is limited to the employees of the organization that he oversees. So, we got this IG report, and the media immediately, it depended on which side, the pro or anti-impeachment faction you listened to. One of them, for example, James Comey. I should actually look up exactly what James Comey said because it was kind of really telling. And I think it was like immediately after the IG report was released on Twitter. Well, I don't know, maybe a couple hours afterwards, James Comey comes out and he says, "So it was all lies. No treason, no spying on the campaign, no tapping Trump's wires. It was just good people trying to protect America." So that's one side of it. They didn't do anything wrong, right? On the other side, the anti-impeachment, most of Fox News, and Bill Barr himself he's the Attorney General, so he's the top cop. They're saying, no, there were a lot of problems. It wasn't just good people trying to protect America, and he pushed back on it a little bit. The Inspector General, for whatever reason, whether it was sort of a flaw because of the scope of his investigation or whatever, he came out, he outlined lots and lots of problems with the process, the FISA process, and also I forgot to mention the other thing they were really looking into is, were they justified in starting the Crossfire Hurricane counterintelligence investigation on the Trump campaign at the end of July? Did they really have a good enough suspicion to use the extreme tactics that they did? And the Inspector General said in his conclusions, regardless of all the details that are in the IG report, he said that, he did feel that they did have a good enough predicate to start this investigation. With the FISA, that was another story. There were, he laid out all kinds of, we even have some numbers. There's 51 violations and 9 false statements just related to the FISA report itself. So, but the thing that, regardless of whether you were watching the pro-impeachment media and people or the anti-impeachment media or people, one thing sort of really came through and did seem to surprise everyone, and that was that Bill Barr immediately issued a statement saying that he disagreed with that this was a justified investigation. And then beyond that, Durham, who is the U.S. Attorney of Connecticut, and Barr has designated him to take this investigation further, to work with the IG, Horowitz, who, remember, he can't do subpoenas, he can't indict anyone, but Durham can. He's a U.S. attorney, he has the full power of the subpoenas, he can call up a grand jury, and he can indict people. So he is still working on it. We don't really have any, it's been very quiet, there haven't been many leaks, or maybe not even any leaks out of his investigation. And he doesn't really say anything. He's just like, everybody knows he's working on it, but we don't really know anything about his investigation. Well, he put out a statement and, he praises, he's like, yeah, I'm going to really paraphrase here. Yeah, Horowitz is an honorable man. But I told him last month that I disagree, with his conclusions. So that was a pretty big deal. All right. So today, there a lot of fuss came out over those two statements, and people were challenging Barr. And in all places, Barr gave an interview today on MSNBC. This was on Andrea Mitchell's show. She has a midday show on MSNBC. Andrea Mitchell is kind of the matriarch of the news people on MSNBC. So she didn't do the interview herself. A guy named Pete Williams did it. And Kyle and I broke this up into some different pieces because we thought the things that Barr said, and it caused quite a fuss. MSNBC, they're still reacting to it. We thought that it was important enough to play some clips from that interview.
Mr. Attorney General, why do you say that the FBI opened the investigation of the Trump campaign on the thinnest of suspicions?
Well, I'm glad to get into the issue of predication, but let me just start out by saying that I think you have to put this in context. I think the heart of the IG's report really focused on how the investigation was conducted once it got going, and that is especially the very serious abuses of FISA that occurred, much of which has been, in my view, not accurately reported by the press over the last day. But in one area, I do disagree with the IG, and that was whether there was sufficient predication to open a full-blown counterintelligence investigation, specifically using the techniques that they did to collect intelligence about the Trump campaign.
Well, as a policy matter, why not open an investigation on a thin pretext? I guess on the one hand, you could say it's a presidential campaign. It's very sensitive. You need better evidence. On the other hand, you could say it's a presidential campaign. We have to be very careful. There could be a threat to our political process.
Well, I think probably from a civil liberties standpoint, the greatest danger to our free system is that the incumbent government use the apparatus of the state, principally the law enforcement agencies and the intelligence agencies, both to spy on political opponents, but also to use them in a way that could affect the outcome of the election. As far as I'm aware, this is the first time in history that this has been done to a presidential campaign, the use of these counterintelligence techniques against a presidential campaign. And we have to remember that in today's world, presidential campaigns are frequently in contact with foreign persons. And indeed, in most campaigns, there are signs of illegal foreign money coming in. And we don't automatically assume that the campaigns are nefarious and traitors and acting in league with foreign powers. There has to be some basis before we use these very potent powers in our core First Amendment activity. And here, I felt this was very flimsy. Basically, I think the department has a rule of reason, which is at the end of the day, is what you're relying on sufficiently powerful to justify the techniques you're using? And the question there is, how strong is the evidence? How sensitive is the activity you're looking at? And what are the alternatives? And I think when you step back here and say, what was this all based on? It's not sufficient. Remember, there was and never has been any evidence of collusion, and yet this campaign and the president's administration has been dominated by this investigation into what turns out to be completely baseless.
I mean, wow, what a strong take by Barr. I mean, you know, the guy is kind of just seems like so average and typical. You know, he just seems like kind of the government guy who's going to go in, stamp his paperwork, you know what I mean, and do the job every day. But here he is coming out pretty strong against the Horowitz report. I think, you know, really disagreeing publicly on a major conclusion that it was okay to launch a full blown investigation. You know, Barr says he disagrees with that. And Joanne, I had to think, you know, from my knowledge and understanding, and, you know, from everything we discussed covering this, understanding the large role that the Steele dossier, you know, played in that, and understanding that is, you know, either largely fictitious or already known, common, mundane knowledge that it was wrong to open this investigation in the first place. And, you know, I don't know if Barr highlights it as much in this clip as others, but, you know, this was a presidential investigation that they were looking into. So you would think that there would be some standard or bar, you know, no pun intended, as to, you know, really be careful when you're going after warrants to investigate a presidential candidate, especially when it's the candidate in the opposition party to the ruling party. You know what? Like, I think there should be even a little bit more extra caution there, just to avoid any potential political bias.
Yeah, I mean, that was the big deal. That was that the incumbent party was using these massive powers, and many people in the country are already doubtful that they should have the amount of power that they have. You know, a lot of us think that some of the stuff that they can do is completely unconstitutional, like the surveillance stuff. The FISA court itself is an enormously powerful vehicle. I think that in itself is unconstitutional. I mean, So you bring, and it involves like an element of trust. It's all about trust in the FISA court. The FBI brings their FISA application to the court, and they basically swear on it. They swear that they have, they have verified this stuff. They have this Woods procedure for verifying material, verifies information, and the judges don't go dig up all this information on their own to find out if it's true. It's all about trust, and there's no defense. The person who this warrant is on, first of all, they don't even know about it. Second of all, they don't get a chance to argue the allegations that are being made that justify being able to spy on practically every aspect of this person's life. So it's all about trust. So, Barr, I think, I don't know if this is really even relevant or not, but Barr has a history, and he originally was a CIA man, and then he's been in the DOJ before. And he helped cover up or at least he helped minimize the damage of the Iran-Contra crimes. So when he came in to this, when he became the Attorney General, I immediately assumed he was a fixer, that he was of the deep state himself, and that he was just going to protect the deep state. And he was going to, just try to smooth this whole thing over, because this is a major crisis in our country. We've gotten kind of normalized. It has become kind of normalized, and we've sort of, been living with it so long that maybe we don't realize that at some point in the future, this is going to be recognized as a major crisis in the country. So I just thought he was going to find a way to smooth it over, and at the same time keep Trump thinking that he was, being a good attorney general. But this interview shows that either he's a really good actor, or he actually is going to he's going to push back against, at least with this one faction. You could call it the Comey faction or the Brennan faction or whatever, the Obama administration faction, that he's going to try to be somewhat fair in this. And he's really pushing against the establishment while he's doing it. So I'd say that's what surprised me. I'm extremely skeptical of Barr, that he's going to, do the right thing, this rule of law that everybody keeps talking about. But I actually started thinking maybe he actually will, or at least he'll do some. At least he'll try to mediate this in a way that is somewhat fair. Maybe he's keeping a whole bunch of other stuff covered up. I don't know. But I found him to be fairly convincing. Did you, Kyle?
Yeah, he seemed sincere to me about what he was saying. And also I think it's something that he may not have needed to do. I think later in the interview, he does kind of get through it and explain one of the reasons that he and, as we'll get to later, Durham made the statements that they made is because of the media coverage, which he does touch on in this chunk of the interview, which I think is important to say, that the media coverage of this, I'm in a group chat with Joanne, that's absolutely fantastic. And so I get all of her little, going through, all the highlights of going through the IG report. But all the initial headlines that I saw on Reuters, all the major news networks minus Fox News, and I think there was one other that I saw that had a pretty decent take, were the IG report vindicates the FBI, says no bias. It basically, the take you would have gotten just from reading headlines was that the IG report vindicated the FBI and said they didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah, just like James Comey's tweet, right? It was all lies, no treason, no spying, no tapping. That's a flat out lie. No tapping Trump's wires per se. They had people wired up, literally, recording conversations. But anyway, yeah, I agree with you there. So,
well, of course, it doesn't turn out that way at the beginning. At the start,
so let's look at look at what the basis of it was. So in May 2016, apparently a 28-year-old campaign volunteer says in a social setting,
this is George Papadopoulos,
and this was described by the foreign official who heard him who couldn't remember exactly what was said, but it was characterized as a suggestion of a suggestion. He suggested that there had been a suggestion from the Russians that they had some adverse information to Hillary, which they might dump in the campaign. Well, what was going on in May? You may recall that we were in the thick of the investigation of Hillary Clinton's secret server, and the media was full of stories, and the blogosphere was full of stories, and political circles in Washington were full of stories and speculation that the Russians had in 2014, 2 years before, hacked into her secret server and were therefore in a position to drop this stuff during the election. In fact, the day before this comment was made in a bar, Fox News was reporting that their sources told them there was a debate going on in the Russian government as to whether or not to drop Hillary Clinton's emails between the intelligence agency and the foreign ministry. But that related to Hillary's server. So the FBI, what the FBI did is later, after the the DNC hack and the dumping through Wikipedia in July. WikiLeaks, in July, they get this information that this somewhat vague statement was made in a bar. And they jumped right into a full-scale investigation before they even went and talked to the foreign officials about exactly what was said. They opened an investigation of the campaign, and they used very intrusive techniques. They didn't do, I think, what would normally be done under those circumstances, which is to go to the campaign. And there certainly were people in the campaign that could be trusted, including a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee and the governor of New Jersey, former U.S. attorney. There were people to talk to. And what I find particularly inexplicable is that they talked to the Russians, but not to the presidential campaign. On August 4th, Brennan braced the head of Russian intelligence. He calls the head of Russian intelligence and says, "We know what you're up to. You better stop it." He did it again later in August. And then President Obama talked to President Putin in September and said, "We know what you're up to. You better cut it out." So they go and confront the Russians, who clearly are the bad guys, and they won't go and talk to the campaigns and say, what is this about?
I mean, a little bit concerning that the guy leading this investigation doesn't know the difference between WikiLeaks and Wikipedia. But other than that, I mean, he definitely seems to be on fire a little bit here and really has, something that he thinks is very important to say. So again, I think that adds to the authenticity, of maybe what Barr is saying here. I guess, Joanne, I was wondering about the Papadopoulos connection here, because that's a guy that we've talked a lot about in the past on the show. And, he brings up the timing there, but just that, this really was a suggestion of a suggestion made in a bar, that Papadopoulos had heard somebody else who, we also suspect, being tied to the intelligence community. And that really, kind of, other than the Steele dossier, one of the things that got this, the ball all rolling on the investigation to Trump's campaign? Because it seems unbelievable. It really does.
It does. And, you can hear the skepticism in his voice. He gets into the weeds a little bit. And he does an important thing. I won't go into any detail, but with this whole thing, it's really important to consider the timelines and consider the context of what was happening at that point in time. If you don't take those things into consideration, it's very difficult to understand this. And so then he also goes he explains the Inspector General's scope and the tools available, like I talked about a little bit earlier, versus what Durham can do. Now, I don't know does everybody know that well enough, or should we do that? Kyle, I apologize. I forget whether we're going to play clip 3 or not.
I think we should play clip 3 because this is something that I wasn't aware of until it was explained to me recently.
Okay,
and
good.
So this is important, and let's go into this now, which is basically Bob Barr explaining the difference between Horowitz and Durham and the two investigators and what they could do. Because honestly, if you hear about it in the media, they just kind of always lump the two together, so you assume they're similar.
Right. And one thing I don't know whether he says, and I said it before, I'm going to emphasize it again. Barr actually assigned Durham to work with the IG. The IG was working on this for a long period of time. And clearly Barr realized at some point in the process that it wasn't going to be enough for the Inspector General, who couldn't do subpoenas, who couldn't bring charges. He can make recommendations, but he can't actually do anything himself. And so he takes Durham and he partners him with Horowitz. So, it's important to know that too. But here's where he talks about, the difference between these two investigations.
So the Inspector General says he found no evidence to indicate that the FBI's decision to start this investigation was based on political bias. Do you agree?
Well, what do you actually, I think you have to understand what the IG's methodology is, and I think it's the appropriate methodology for an Inspector General. He starts with limited information. He can only talk to people who are essentially there as employees, and he's limited to the information generally in the FBI. But his approach is to say, if I get an explanation from the people I'm investigating that is not unreasonable on its face, then I will accept it as long as there's not contradictory testimonial or documentary evidence. In other words, it's a very deferential standard. And all he said is, people gave me an explanation and I didn't find anything to contradict it, so I don't have a basis for saying that there was improper motive. But he hasn't decided the issue of improper motive. Have you? No. I think we have to wait until the investigation, the full investigation is done, and that's the fundamental distinction between what Durham is doing and what the IG is doing. Durham is not limited to the FBI. He can talk to other agencies. He can compel people to testify. One of the problems in the IG's investigation, I think he would agree, is that Comey refused to sign back up for his security clearance and therefore couldn't be questioned about classified matters. So someone like Durham can compel testimony. He can talk to a whole range of people, private parties, foreign governments, and so forth. And I think that is the point at which a decision has to be made about motivations. And I think right now it would be premature to make any judgment one way or the other.
Yeah, so he said a couple of important things there.
Yeah,
One
absolutely.
Is that, he says that the IG basically takes them at their word. Whatever they tell him, if he thinks it's reasonable, he puts it down in the report. The other is that he hints at other agencies that are involved. And I think clearly there he's talking about the CIA, because we know that Durham is looking into the CIA. And then something I didn't know, Kyle, did you hear what he said about Comey? He said that he turned down. Yeah, he turned down so Comey doesn't have a security clearance anymore. He refused to, sign the continuation of his security clearance. Therefore, he can't be asked anything about classified information. That was pretty slick, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's a nifty little trick that James Comey found out, apparently. I did want to say something just about John Durham, because I guess I feel like there's a little bit of some optimism after hearing that.
Yeah. And
just that this is a guy that had an opportunity to more thoroughly pursue charges against the Bush administration, and assist Daniel Jones in his investigation into the torture under the Bush program, and was kind of stonewalled there. If anybody's watched the report recently, and he's talking about I think it was like an assistant. I don't remember the title, but it was Durham, who is now leading this investigation, was leading some of the investigations at the Justice Department at the time into the torture program.
Yeah, other people, and forgive me for not knowing the details about Whitey Bulger, but there's something too about his involvement with the Whitey Bulger investigation too, which maybe I shouldn't have even brought it up. But yeah, there are reasons to doubt this guy. He's painted as the epitome sort of internal investigation guy. He's the one that does hold them accountable, and they're all scared of him. Oh my God, Durham's looking into us. We're in trouble now. But I don't know. What about the results? So yeah, I feel the same way about Durham. So we'll see.
Yeah,
So
the next clip I think is a really important one. If we can move on to that about kind of what was the harm and why is this investigation so important, right?
I just wonder, though, about what the FBI would say, I think, here is, okay, so they opened an investigation. Nobody was ever charged. They were concerned about possible Russian meddling in the election. Why not open this investigation? What's the harm? You've said intrusive means. So what is your concern about the fact that they did this?
Well, I think the big picture is this. From day one, remember, they say, okay, we're not going to go to talk to the campaign. We're going to put people in there, wire them up, and have these conversations with people involved in the campaign, because that way we'll get the truth. From the very first day of this investigation, which was July 31st, 2016, all the way to its end in September 2017, there was not one incriminatory bit of evidence to come in. It was all exculpatory. The people that they were taping denied any involvement with Russia, denied the very specific facts that the FBI was relying on. So what happens? The FBI ignores it, presses ahead, withholds that information from the court, withholds critical exculpatory information from the court while it gets a electronic surveillance warrant. It also withholds from the court clear-cut evidence that the dossier that they ultimately relied on to get the FISA warrant was a complete sham. They hid information about the lack of reliability even when they went the first time for the warrant. But in January, after the election, the entire case collapsed when the principal source says, I never told Steele this stuff. And this was all speculation. And I have zero information to support this stuff. At that point, when their entire case collapsed, what did they do? They kept on investigating the president and well into his administration after the case collapsed. But here, to me, is the damning thing. They not only didn't tell the court that what they had been relying on was completely, rubbish. They actually started putting in things to bolster the Steele report by saying, well, we talked to the sources and they appeared to be truthful. But they don't inform the court that what they're truthful about is that the dossier is false. So that's hard to explain. And the core statement, in my opinion, by the IG is that these irregularities, these misstatements, these omissions were not satisfactorily explained. And I think that leaves open the possibility to infer bad faith. I think it's premature now to reach a judgment on that, but I think that further work has to be done, and that's what Durham is doing.
yeah, so he's digging at a number of things there when he says it might be bad faith. And I think that's probably a big understatement. I think he betrays and maybe this is just my own bias, but I think he betrays his own belief that this was not done in good faith. And, and he gives some of the details that were not in the media reporting. He also starts focusing on what happened post-election. He's talking about not just the run-up to the election. He makes another interesting comment about how they actually started to bolster the information with the insufficient information that they had. They started to bolster it. And I read some things about that in Lee Smith's book that are kind of interesting too, about kind of how this dossier evolved. So, I thought that was particularly damning, that those statements by Barr, and I think he almost completely undermined the Inspector General there, or maybe not the Inspector General himself, but the process. I think he's saying this process, it did point out a lot of things, and but I don't know. I think he kind of undermined the whole thing, the basis of the whole thing.
Well, certainly what he describes sounds absolutely criminal. He basically says the FBI targeted the Trump administration. They had no solid evidence whatsoever. I believe he says that every bit of evidence they collected was exculpatory, which means it like actually says Trump wasn't involved in any kind of secret, collusion with the Russians, rather than proving the opposite. And that, the FBI, it's like, they go to the court and they say, we need a warrant to spy on this guy because we think he's selling drugs. And they don't tell the judge that, well, at the same time, we send a whole bunch of informants at this guy. And every time he says, yeah, dude, I don't sell drugs. I don't know what you're talking about. You know what I mean? Because that's what happened here. And then to make it even worse, they cook up this whole fake dossier against Trump, the Steele dossier, right? Well, the FBI didn't do it, but they latched onto it and used it in this case. And so that's all made up and it's all junk, but they didn't tell that to the judge. So, they create a whole bunch of, fake evidence for, getting a warrant against you. And then when it turns out that, it's getting exposed that that's junk, rather than saying that, they say all the, people in the report who said, yeah, it was untrue are credible. And so that gives credibility to the report that they're saying is untrue. I mean, I don't see how that's anything but illegal.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I don't know which law it violates, but it violates laws.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you just boiled that down to a simple analogy, because, I mean, that's outrageous. That's cherry picking things that are damning to a person and deliberately omitting the things that are, as they say, exculpatory, but the things that contradict it. And Carter Page has been on television complaining about that for a really long time. And they're kind of unleashed now. Same with Nunez. I haven't watched much of their interview. I've seen a little bits of their interviews, but yeah, I mean, it's just like you said. It's like putting things in there that hint at the person being a drug dealer and deliberately omitting sort of obvious statements that show they're not.
Right. Yeah.
How can that not be bad faith? Bad faith is a euphemism.
Right. Well, I think at the point then when you get into saying that, adding credibility to the Steele dossier because the people who are mentioned in it said what was in there was untrue, but that because that was the truth that they were more credible. And so saying like the people in the dossier were credible. I mean, that's just outright lying. Like, you could use the word misled, as we were talking about before, how everybody's attached to this word misled now because, I guess lying implies criminal charges in some cases, where misleading is, like you were off base a little bit, but generally you had it right. If we could move on to the next clip that we have, which I think is really important, just boiling things down to the simplicity, which is, was the Trump campaign spied on? Imagine we're now in December of 2020, Joanne, and the Trump has just won re-election, and it turns out that the FBI under Trump investigated and surveilled the, let's say, Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders campaign. What do you think the Democrats will be doing and saying then? I imagine they won't be very happy. So asking this question and getting an answer is very important. Does Barr believe that the Trump campaign was spied on?
But I thought no one is above the law, Kyle. Anyway, here's the number 7 clip.
Based on what you know so far, do you still stand by your statement that the campaign was spied upon?
Oh, it's clearly spied upon. I mean, that's what electronic surveillance is. I think wiring people up to go in and talk to people and make recordings of their conversations is spying. I think going through people's emails, which they did as a result of the FISA warrant, they went through everything, from Page's life.
Because he wasn't in the campaign at the point where he began the surveillance.
Yes, but his emails go back. I mean, the main reason they were going for the FISA warrant initially was to go back historically and seize all his emails and texts and all that stuff from back months and even years. So they were covering the period that he was in the campaign, and that's exactly the reason they went for the FISA, to get that stuff.
He seems to know. He says that pretty definitively, doesn't he? He knows why they did what they did.
Right, but but just laying it out there that, you know, the FBI and spied on the Trump campaign. I think, you know, as kind of a theme in this episode, you know, kind of looking back to what was happening in 2016, when Donald Trump said his campaign was spied on, he was kind of laughed off. Like, nobody took that seriously. And had it been true, I think it would have been a real scandal at the time. And now you have the Attorney General just flat out saying it, and he lays out a case that's absolutely indisputable, and nobody, it's not a headline. I don't know how, but it's not.
Can I just read James Comey's Twitter tweet again? He said, so it was all lies, no treason, no spying on the campaign, no tapping Trump's wires. It was just good people trying to protect America. So just to bring that contrast again, it's outrageous, right?
Yeah. I mean, you know, we are talking about here, and, you know, for anybody who I guess is just very unsympathetic to Trump, think about, like, had you know, this been a Barack Obama and he's looking at the fact that his campaign was spied upon. I think there's a lot of people looking at criminal charges for the people involved in the spying in that case. And because of the whole Russia hysteria, it's not happening here. And it's shocking, but this seems to be the reality that we're living in.
Yeah, and that's a good way to frame it because, you know, from my point of view, someone who was a Bernie supporter in 2016, we have no doubt, Kyle, no doubt at all that they could and would do the exact same thing to Bernie. So maybe that's why even though I'm really uncomfortable that this is a defense of a person who I think has done plenty of other things to deserve impeachment and otherwise don't like, you know, I can just blank the Trump face out. To me, this is more the whatever. Just insert any president in here and think of it that way. So yeah, I'm glad you framed it that way. He also go ahead.
I was just gonna say I thought this zeroing in on Carter Page and going back through the emails and laying out that, you know, they went for the campaign emails, like getting a hold of what was going on in the Trump campaign was what they were trying to do. And seeing how they were investigating, like, Trump's connections with Putin and Trump's, you know, policy and positions towards Russia, it seems like the FBI probably would have been going through just like all the communications, right? It seems very intrusive. And again, as Barr points out, I think, you know, in any other circumstance, every single person in this country would agree that if the FBI is investigating a presidential campaign, they should try to be as inintrusive as possible.
Yeah, and the other important thing is I'm pretty sure they get what's called two hops, right? So they don't just get Carter Page's communications, right? Don't they get everyone he communicated with and everyone they communicated with?
That's my understanding.
So they get basically they get a massive tranche of communications by doing this. And there's a section in the IG report that I spent some time reading too about there were other people who were informants who were involved, you know, who had communications with the FBI, and they were unnamed. But these were people who were involved with the campaign, involved with the administration, and the Horowitz interviews the people. He asks, you know, Strzok and Page and everybody else about them. And they say things like, oh yeah, well, either, oh, I didn't know they were involved with the Trump campaign, or they say, oh, well, you know, when I didn't know they were an informant. And so once I would never have authorized contact and getting information from that informant. So there's actually even more that's kind of buried in this. And one of the things I took away from that was I was surprised that Horowitz let them off so easy. And of course I was really wondering who they were. I was wondering, who was it? Was it my former governor, Chris Christie? Were they acting as informants? I don't know. Was it Jeff Sessions? There are a whole lot of people who it could have been. So there's even more to this than we know. Then the next clip, he talks some more about number 7. He talks some more about the Durham investigation.
So what do you think, what questions will John Durham address that the IG didn't?
Well, Durham is looking at the whole waterfront. He is looking at the issue of how it got started. He's looking at whether or not the narrative of Trump being involved in the Russian interference actually preceded July and wasn't, in fact, the precipitating trigger for the investigation. He's also looking at the conduct of the investigation. There are some things that were done in the investigation that are not included in Horowitz's report, and he's looking at those things. But also, a few weeks ago, I told him that he should spend just as much attention on the post-election period. And I did that because of some of the stuff that Horowitz has uncovered, which to me is inexplicable. Inexplicable. Well, what I said is their case collapsed after the election, and they never told the court, and they kept on getting renewals on these applications. There was documents falsified in order to get these renewals. There was all kinds of withholding of information from the court. And the question really is, what was the agenda after the election that kept them pressing ahead after their case collapsed? This is the President of the United States.
You, of course, went to 3 countries with him. Why did you have to do that? And some people have said, well, this is clearly Bill Barr's in charge of the investigation.
Well, the presentation of that in the media has been silly. The person running the investigation is John Durham. But this is a very unusual circumstance where we are going to foreign governments and asking them to assist and cooperate, including, some of their sensitive materials and personnel. And a U.S. attorney doesn't show up on the doorstep in some of these countries like London and say, hey, I want to talk to your intelligence people and so forth. All the regularities were followed. I went through my purpose was to introduce Durham to the appropriate people and set up a channel that he could work with these countries. At the request of the country, I went through the ambassadors of each country, and the governments wanted to initially talk to me to find out, what is this about? What are the ground rules? Is this going to be a criminal case? Are you going to, do a public report? They wanted to understand the ground rules before they met with Durham, and I met with him, and then I set up appropriate channels. This was perfectly appropriate.
Speaking of whether something is appropriate or not, was it appropriate for John Durham to issue his statement yesterday, given that he's a U.S. attorney with the grand jury and his investigation isn't done yet?
I think it was definitely appropriate because I think it was necessary to avoid public confusion. I think it was sort of being reported by the press that the issue of predication was sort of done and over, even though it was a very limited look at that issue by the IG, given the narrowness of his, of the evidence available to him. And I think it was important for people to understand that Durham's work was not being preempted. And that Durham was doing something different, and he explains what he's doing different, and that there are areas of disagreement. I think it was perfectly appropriate, so the public understood the relationship between the two exercises.
Yeah. So I thought Barr was really clear here and explained things pretty well. The most interesting point of that I saw was the FBI's continuing investigation after the election. Continuing to push, the bad and misleading FISA information, or in the FISA courts to continue to get warrants. And this seems to be the whole hemming in of Trump's foreign policy. Somebody who came in and as a candidate generally talked more about ending war than starting war, and generally seemed, he talked openly about becoming a war criminal. Wanting to dip bullets in pigs' blood and shit, terrible things that he had planned to do when he became president. However, he talked about getting along with Kim Jong-un, resolving the situation in Syria, withdrawing from Afghanistan, drawing down NATO a little bit, getting along better with Putin, having a lot of different foreign policy views. And so, focusing in on that part of the operation, I think is really important because that's the whole of trying to alter Trump's foreign policy now that he's already been elected.
Yeah, I don't know if I've ever heard him say before. He says their case collapsed after the election, and yet they pushed forward and they kept with the renewals of the FISA. So they wanted to keep an ear on what was going on, right? They were still getting all these communications. And I think the points that you made, whatever insurance policy or use as leverage against the Trump's foreign policy that they so vehemently opposed. But I guess I also, I kind of have had this thought from the beginning. I think that they were, and he says, what was their agenda? My thoughts have always been that their agenda was also personal. I think that they were scared to death that now this guy who they had undermined, and he was going to figure out that they were undermining him, and now he has a lot of power, and he's going to come after them. And I think they just wanted to use leverage to wage, some kind of factional lawfare. I think it's still going on. I think this sort of IG report and impeachment, they're sort of inching ahead of you do this, and well, we'll hit back with that, and you do that, and then we'll hit back with that. I just think there's some kind of a tactical war of sorts going on here, and I think that they had their own interests in mind as well. The one other thing here that I thought was interesting is that Barr has sort of set himself up. He says he's trying to explain, well, why did you make these statements? Why did you contradict or question the IG, and why did you come out and make a public statement about it? And he says, well, I wanted to avoid public confusion. And he's probably referring back to where he said that the media is just advancing this ridiculous narrative, or just at the very, at best, a confusing and misleading, there we go with that word again, narrative. And so Barr has sort of positioned himself as like Barr versus the corporate media here, which is interesting.
Right. Well, I think he understands that, like, once you establish a narrative and you have a mantra like the surge worked, it's a good one that I always go back to, because people just say the surge worked, even now, even after ISIS. But that's something that I guess he doesn't want to establish, because then if, down the road, Durham comes out and has all these, scathing reports and indictments, and, is really, as we'll get into the next clip, going after the gross violations in the FISA courts, and who knows what else, then if it comes out of nowhere, I guess people are going to be less receptive to it, think maybe it's more political. Whereas if, they're leading up to it right now saying that, hey, this is a totally different thing, I'm explaining it in, December of 2019. So in the spring or summer of 2020, when the Durham report comes out, and whatever comes of that, the American people have a little bit of understanding. Yeah.
And I mentioned lawfare, but all of this is clearly, an information war too. And I guess if I am going to bring up people having personal agendas, just to be fair, I should also consider the fact that maybe Barr has a personal agenda himself, right? The president who he serves and is to some extent helping to defend, that's, his job's on the line too, isn't it? If Trump gets impeached, then he's going to be out the door himself. So I don't know how much of, Barr came out of retirement for this. He never seems particularly enthusiastic about the job. So I don't know how much he would care if he just had to go back into retirement. But yeah, maybe his own, reputation and, has his own personal agenda too. So yeah, the next part is where he just, and I should set this up a little bit, because I cut out the question that he was asked. The question he was asked was something like, well, what would be your response to people who are saying, oh, look, Barr is just acting as President Trump's lawyer. So sort of demeaning the role of the Attorney General. And I think Barr got a little bit ticked off at that question. It set him off. And I think that's why his tone, I think you'll notice a little bit of a tone change in this when he gets a little bit more strong in his language and such. But he also reveals kind of how he really feels about it.
I think our nation was turned on its head for 3 years. I think based on a completely bogus narrative that was largely fanned and hyped by an irresponsible press. And I think that there were gross abuses of FISA and inexplicable behavior that is intolerable in the FBI. And the Attorney General's primary responsibility is to protect against the abuse of the law enforcement and intelligence apparatus and make sure that it doesn't play an improper role in our political life. That's my responsibility, and I'm going to carry it out.
I don't know about you, but I think he really kind of revealed how he really feels about the whole thing in that one.
Right. And, you know, one of the reasons that I feel so comfortable playing, you know, all these Barr clips on the show is because just over the past few years, all the research that I've done and, you know, Joanne's done and we've talked about on the show makes me pretty comfortable with the narrative that Barr is putting forward here of the gross violations, the FOIA violations by the FBI and, you know, understanding how the Steele dossier came about, the connections with Fusion GPS and, all the other details that we really can't get into since we're already over an hour, Joanne. Uh-huh. But, you know, just as it goes, you know, the case he's putting forward here seems fairly backed by the facts of the situation and, you know, why we should continue to remain skeptical of anything the U.S. government and the Attorney General does if they really are, you know, moving forward here and looking at holding some people accountable for gross violations of FOIA courts, which, you know, may end up being people kind of going away to, not cover up, but as the patsies of a bigger conspiracy then maybe that is the case and a little bit unfortunate, but, you know, it does seem like that Barr has a general understanding of what happened here. You know, for the past, almost 4 years now, if we look at this goes back to, you know, early 2016 or so, the propaganda and everything that we've all been subject to, the false narrative put forward and here finding out a little bit of the truth, how this all came about. And, you know, I don't know if I have anything more to say than that, but I want to make sure I got that out there. Because I don't want it to sound like I'm just agreeing with everything that Bob Barr says because he's Attorney General.
Right. And in fact, there's one thing that he said that I I was glad that he said it, but I don't agree with the premise that that's the primary role of the Attorney General to make sure that these powerful state apparatuses, the law enforcement agencies are not abused. He said that that's his primary role. His primary role is enforcing the law, but I'm glad that he sees it as a major role for him. And I think it shows that first of all, he loves these agencies. He reveres them. He wants to make sure, and I think a lot of people are afraid, and some of them have expressed this. You'll often hear Andrew McCarthy expressing this. What they're really, really worried about is that the public is going to say enough and is going to strip them of their powers, if not abolish them altogether and, come up with some new system. So that things are so bad that they fear that kind of thing is going to happen. And it looks to me, and I might be wrong, but it looks to me like Bill Barr, with that goal in mind of not losing these things and the powers that they have, is willing to hold some people accountable. He's willing to call out the abuses, because I don't think he ever otherwise would have. I think he just would have found a way to cover it up. But I think it's so bad that he knows he has to do something. I think it's also interesting that, it shocks me that he called out these gross abuses. Like you said, we're not surprised by that. We're not surprised by that at all. But there's this thing where it's fine when it happens to the lesser people, when it's used against them. But as soon as it becomes an internal factional war of these, I don't know what you call it, these
right.
people
No, it's the same thing that happens when Dianne Feinstein's Senate committee gets spied on.
Yeah, exactly.
Then spying's abusive and spying's terrible and the CIA needs to be reined in. But, they're spying on every single American. Dianne Feinstein does not care. So, that is unfortunate, but at the same time, you really want to jump on these cases and be like, yes, we need to reform the FBI now because of this.
Yeah. So again, and I apologize for being so apologetic I'm constantly giving all these disclaimers. I don't like this guy. I don't trust this guy. I'm skeptical of this guy. But, what he's doing right now, okay, so I support it. I think I'm just going to stop saying that anymore. But it bothers me. It's uncomfortable.
No, it especially, when you're talking about the likes of Bob Barr and Rudy Giuliani, and all these characters. But, this is the very unfortunate situation that the Democrats have put us in, where they've pursued this fictitious impeachment against Donald Trump and this fake Russiagate scandal for 3 years. And unfortunately, it may be the case that it ends up being the victory that gets Donald Trump reelected after 3 years of a nothing policy. Too bad they couldn't have focused on any of the real scandals the whole time. And, I don't know. I guess I don't have much else to add to that. I guess we should try and probably wrap up here soon, Joanne, if you have any final thoughts.
Yeah. Did you go to call me Dianne Feinstein again?
No.
I'm just kidding you. Yeah, there's just one more thing. They talk about a few other things in the interview, and then they come back to the Durham investigation. And I won't bother with the clip, but he wants to know, what's Durham, what's his end game? Is he going to produce a report, and when is all this stuff going to happen? Which is the question, kind of foremost in a lot of people's minds right now. Barr says, I don't know if he's going to produce a report. We didn't talk about that yet. And he says that, Durham is not going to finish up anytime really soon. He said, unlike a lot of people seem to think Durham's going to finish really soon. I think he's referring to a Trump statement made just yesterday or the other day that Trump said that Durham's going to finish in the not too distant future. And Barr said, no, I think I'm more likely it's going to be late spring or early summer. And, I hope that is true, because my skepticism leads me to think that they're just stringing the Trump supporters along to say, don't worry. This IG report is not the end. We got Durham, and Durham's really going to get him. And if they can just drag Durham's investigation along for long enough and Trump doesn't get reelected, that thing will just get flushed right down the toilet. That nothing will ever happen with it. So,
I was actually thinking that the Trump administration, if they have a lot, will try to drag it along until September or October and then drop it on everybody. So this is a giant victory going into the election.
And there's that too.
Yeah. So I guess the earlier it comes out to me, the less it's going to be political no matter what. It's going to be an absolute nightmare. But the sooner it comes out, I think the less political it'll be.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that they are using these things, the proximity of the impeachment articles in the IG report. Although, to be fair, the IG report, the date that it was going to be released was announced several weeks ago. So,
right.
But yeah, I think they are using what they have to some extent strategically, but a little harder for Barr to do that since these things take a long time, and it's not something you can just kind of pull out of your pocket like an impeachment article. But yeah, I think we've probably gone on way too long, and unfortunately, I'm in the weeds of this a bit. So it's good that you're able to sort of bring it back up to the 500-foot level. And anyway, hopefully people found it useful. There's a lot to this, both big and small. There's a lot of little details that are important, and there are also a lot of big questions that are important too. But anyway, thanks for being patient about it.
All right, everybody. Thanks for listening. Check out my work, my show, my news roundup. Find it at libertarianinstitute.org. Make sure you're all subscribed to Joanne's show on Twitter, Around the Empire. And then the website for the show is just aroundtheempire.com. Right, Joanne?
That's right, Kyle.
All right. Thanks.
Later.